2, 1. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is McKaylee. I work at Tattered Bookstore. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for supporting local independent bookstores. Thank you for shopping locally. It means more to us than you will ever know. Over the past year, you're the reason that we've been able to stay open. And over the past 50 years, that's the same as well. Because 2021 is Tattered Cover's 50th anniversary, which is an amazing feat for a bookstore. And we owe a large part of that to you, our audience. So thank you so much for being a part of this community, whether it is virtual or soon to be in person. We're getting there slowly but surely. And so we thank you all so much for that. Before I go any further, I want to let you know that closed captioning is enabled for those who might want it or need it. There's a black bar at the bottom of the screen with a button labeled CC on it. Click this button and closed captioning is enabled should you want it or need it. I want to let you know a little bit about Tattered Cover for those who might be joining us outside of the Denver metro area. We are a local independent bookstore located in Colorado, and we currently have 4 locations, one of which just moved and is in a brand new building, which we opened this weekend. And our 5th location is going to be opening in just a couple of weeks here. We're very, very close. If you go to Stanley Marketplace, which is where it's going to be located, you can actually see the green our iconic green and on the walls and the bookshelves. It's slowly but surely coming together, so you can see it all there. Check out more updates for that on our website at tatteredcover.com. Also on our website is our events. Holy moly, we have so many events, I can't even tell you. This week alone, we have amazing events coming up. Site Fidelity by local author Claire Boyles is tomorrow, when we're celebrating the release of that. Friday, we have Chaney Kwok, who in his book, The Passenger, with one of our favorites, Nate Hake, is in conversation with him. So just check it out, sign up, register at tatteredcover.com/event. But the one that we have tonight, man, we are in for an amazing talk because this book is intense. Like, I don't have any other words for this book other than intense. It is a whirlwind, and I'm so excited to talk to Paul Howarth today, who's the author of Dust Off the Bones, which is the newest novel from him. It's a sequel. People are calling it a sequel. It follows a similar timeline, but I think it can hold up on its own. So a little bit about Paul, our author. Paul Howarth is a British Australian author and former lawyer who holds an MA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia, where he was awarded the Malcolm Bradbury Scholarship. In 2018, his debut novel, Only Killers and Thieves, was published to international acclaim, winning the Barnes & Noble Discover Award for Best Fiction and appearing on numerous other awards and Books of the Year lists. And like I said earlier, we are celebrating Dust Off the Bones, which is his newest work. So I'm going to change over the camera here so that we can see and talk to Paul. Here we go. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for staying up so late and being with us and your fans here in Colorado. We really appreciate it. I am so excited to talk about this book with you, but I'd love it if you could give us a taste of Dust Off the Bones by telling us a little bit what it's about. And I think you have a short reading prepared for us as well.
Yeah, I do. I'd love to. So this is my new novel. It's called Dust Off the Bones. It's a historical thriller set in Queensland, Australia, in kind of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. At a time when Australia as a country wasn't really the Australia we know today. It was still a collection of British colonies, self-governing British colonies. But outside the cities, in the kind of unsettled centre, was very reminiscent of the American West. So there was kind of still, as I say, loads of unsettled land. There were gold rushes, there were gunslingers, there were cattle drives, exploration, dust-filled frontier towns, all that kind of stuff. And not many people know about it. That's the thing. There's this kind of alternate Wild West going on the other side of the world. So that's where I throw our readers in this book, is into that kind of atmosphere. And we follow 2 brothers who are estranged at opposite ends of the colony, both literally and figuratively on the run from their past. When they were teenagers, they went through a fairly horrific ordeal. Their family was murdered, and then they found themselves complicit in a reprisal killing of the local indigenous people, the Kuro, who were wrongly accused of having committed the crime. That that killing took place at the hands of an outfit called the Queensland Native Police, which is a true history arm of kind of colonial law enforcement, operated throughout Australia and other British colonies at the time, where basically small gangs of, they were effectively mercenaries, were given a kind of license to kill up and down the frontier. And now the boys are trying to move on with their lives. They become young men. One kind of buries his head in the sand, doesn't want to confront his guilt, doesn't want to really look backwards. He's trying to forge a career for himself in the shadow of his father's legacy. The other one is haunted and, as I say, literally on the run from everything that happened to him. But as the dust jacket says, even in the outback, the past can't stay buried forever. And when an inquest is launched into the killings, the two boys, men now as they are, find themselves on a collision course again, not only with each other and with their pasts, but with a man called Police Inspector Edmund Noon, who led the attack on the Coorong people. And now, in order to save his own skin, has to find the brothers and attempt to silence them both for good. So that's kind of the crux of the book. I thought what I'd do, normally when you do these things, you read kind of the first few paragraphs from chapter 1 and, you know, let readers kind of get the gist of what it's about. But because I've just talked about Noon, and because I've just talked about the brothers kind of coming face to face with him once more, I thought I'd skip forward just a little bit. So this is chapter 3. This is the end of chapter 3. And this is when poor Billy, he's the one who's kind of burying his head in the sand, doesn't want to confront what's happened. He's just got set up again as a kind of cattle rancher, basically. He's revived his father's old ranch. He's finally got some cattle in the pastures. He thinks he's sort of turning his life around. And he's out working in the fields one day. As we're about to see, he then comes home to find that his past has caught up with him again. So this is a short reading, but here we go. Billy pulled the horse around and rode him south for home. 2 hours across a barren scrubland no amount of rain could cure, the soil dry and brittle, choked by dust and stones. His thoughts wandering out ahead of him to another evening alone by the fire, another meal of stale salt beef. Unless there was time to go hunting before sundown, he figured. Rustle up some fresh meat, maybe fill the bathtub and leave it warming. It was ages since he'd last washed. He could bathe while the meat was roasting, scrub his clothes after, then eat and smoke and watch the sunset, drink a little rum, raise a toast to the new cattle, to his family's run reborn. 4 loose horses were waiting for him when he rode into the yard. All were saddled and loaded with supplies, snuffling the weed-strewn gravel, drinking from the trough. Billy reined up and dismounted, drew and cocked his revolver, walked slowly into the yard. His gaze flitted between the buildings. His boots crunched the stones. The house door was open, as were some of the sheds, and the horses were unfamiliar. They weren't from Broken Ridge. The men slid from behind walls and out of doorways and were converging on Billy before he even noticed they were there. 2 black men, their carbines leveled at him, marching deliberately across the yard, and 1 white boy, smiling shyly, sauntering with an enormous rifle pinned behind his neck. Billy lowered the hammer on his revolver, let it hang loose at his side. On they came, these 3 men, Billy alternating between them and only now registering the pale trousers and blue tunics the 2 black men wore. The white boy was dressed in tan moleskins and an ill-fitting khaki shirt, and though he was chewing tobacco, looked no older than 16. He resembled a workhouse urchin, pug nose, narrow eyes, filthy hair, a cleft in his chin and acne pocked on his cheeks. But from their get-up, Billy already had a good idea who these strangers were. The white boy was a native police officer. His troopers were in uniform. And now that he'd realized, now that he saw the troopers more clearly as they closed across the yard, he wondered if maybe they weren't familiar, if he didn't know them from before, from when he and Tommy had gone out after their family's killers and they had, "Fellas," Billy called, waving. "Good to see you. How have you been?" They were unimpressed by his bluster. nothing in their faces at all, one on each side fixing Billy with their carbines while the boy rolled lazily towards him, scarecrowed by his rifle still. Desperately, Billy tried to remember the troopers' names. One was older, bald-headed, a face sunken to its bones. The other bigger, younger, stronger, his left eye knotted with scars. Priest or bishop, maybe? Something to do with God? He looked at the boy anxiously. What are you doing here? What's this about? As if by way of an answer, a slow boot tread sounded on the house veranda, and all heads, including Billy's, turned. He remembered, with a shiver, that there had been a fourth horse. In the shadow of the porch, a very tall man uncoiled himself through the open doorway and stepped up to the rail. He wore a peacock feather waistcoat with a gold watch chain and had a dark long coat draped over one arm. With the other hand, he drank from father's favourite mug, his initials stenciled on the bottom, the only one he'd ever used. Billy watched the mug rise and fall and rise again, and as it did, he saw the tall man smile. Hello, Billy, Noon said. Now isn't this a pleasant surprise?
Shut up! I got shivers, man. Oh my gosh. Man, there's just so much more of that in Dust Off the Bones. I have to talk to you about this story and how this historic event, unfortunately an untold part of history that isn't well known. You were even saying, how did it fall into your lap? How did you find it? Well, what struck that spark of inspiration?
No, sure. So as you said in my introduction, I'm British Australian. I'm in the UK now, but I used to live over there for a period in my kind of late 20s and 30s. And having moved from the UK to Australia, I kind of realized that I didn't know a great deal about the history that my two countries shared. And it's one of those things, strangely, that's kind of overlooked, both here and in Australia. That whole colonial period during almost all of the 19th century, it kind of gets skipped over, and you come to realize why. But as I was kind of new to the history, I just started reading basically for my own interest, my own education, and as I was saying before, became fascinated with the idea that there was this kind of alternate Wild West going on that no one had heard of, especially when set against the landscape. So whether you've seen pictures or know anything about Australia, you'll know that a huge part of it is just called the outback, and it's basically uninhabited or largely uninhabited. And the British and other Europeans, when they arrived, found it utterly impossible to conquer. I mean, it's kind of laughable, really, when you look back to what they tried to do. You know, they were planting crops in the desert and sort of ripping up trees and hoping they could graze cattle in places that cattle just shouldn't be. And what they came to realize, and you know, if anyone's traveled there, is that the outback is such a kind of character in itself. It's so ungovernable, and you either kind of fall in line with the terrain, or the terrain eats you up. And the idea of this sort of alternate Wild West playing out against that was just fascinating to me. And I thought it lent itself, because it hadn't been hugely covered. I mean, there are the odd book, the odd movie, that kind of thing, but it wasn't anywhere near as popular as its American counterpart. So I was thinking, well, there's got to be a story worth telling here. And it wasn't really until I came upon this arm of colonial law enforcement, this force called the Queensland Native Police, which for century, well, nearly a century, was basically wiped from the history books. At the time, the force was kind of legitimate. It was operating in plain sight. Records were kept, reports were filed. There was a chain of command. There was kind of operational rules and all this sort of thing. But as sort of the 20th century dawned and the force sort of fell out of favor, I think a lot of that was kind of swept under the carpet. But thanks to the work of a few historians, they managed to kind of cobble together what little there was and come up with really this compelling story of, like I say, this little known force given a license to kill. You've got the alternate Wild West, you've got the landscape, and it was all of a sudden, it was like the whole thing just kind of merged in my mind. And I couldn't help but think, like, what would it have been like to have been one of those settlers trying to sort of carve out a life, or in the case of my two protagonists, Billy and Tommy, being young boys kind of thrust into that world and try and grow up to be good people, to kind of not be corrupted by the violence or the hardship or, you know, everything else that's going on. And, you know, let's throw them in there and kind of see what happens. And the dust off the bones is the result.
Absolutely. No, and it's so interesting. And I want to touch on the landscape, because the setting is it's a character in its own right in this book.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I want to talk about what your connection is to that, what you learned about the Outback, and how you believe setting influenced this story so much. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're dead right. The character, the landscape kind of becomes a character almost through its own force of will, because if you're setting a story in this situation, the landscape needs to come to life, and once it does, you realize, right, that pretty much dictates everything. So, you know, if you've got characters moving through, you know, the absolute desert, you know, you've got kind of water is scarce, if at all. You can't get any food, and that kind of dictates the way the story has to be told. But there's a huge range. You know, Australia isn't just outback, and that's what I loved about writing this book. I was able to kind of take a reader not only through the outback itself, but to what Aussies would call the bush, which is the kind of more verdant sort of areas of like Victoria or sort of central or southern Queensland, northern New South Wales, where you get this huge variety in landscape. And it was just great fun to be able to kind of like virtually travel through. Especially doing it back then, you know, it's different now. Like I've traveled through what you call kind of the guts of Australia, straight up the middle, but you do it on a camper van. You've got kind of electricity, you've got campsites, you can pull over at a rest stop and all this kind of thing. Imagine doing it on a horse, you know, going through the desert, especially with men chasing you, and kind of thinking, well, not only do I have to stay out the way of these guys, but I've got to find water, I've got to find food. And I mean, it's a brutal place, but it's also just stunningly beautiful as well. And as an author, that kind of landscape is a gift, because you can conjure kind of emotion, drama, just like beauty on the page by doing nothing other than describing the world as it already exists. So it's a gift. It's fantastic.
Well, you picked the right place then. But not only did you travel to this terrain and this amazing setting, but you traveled in time, you know, and the fact that you were able to really bring us into this world and still make it so relatable, something that I will say, as an American, I knew nothing about. And
Yeah.
to me, like, I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit more about the research of delving back into that period. Like you said, the details of traveling on horse, what does survival look like? You know, what people wore, you know, what was that process like for you? And what
Yeah.
was it like transferring it and applying it to the story you had created in your mind?
All of that. Yeah. All of that stuff. And you kind of maybe don't realize, you maybe biting off a little bit more than you can chew when you start out. You think, yeah, fine, I can set this story here. It'll be great. I kind of know about the time, you know about the landscape, you kind of roughly know the history and the politics and all this sort of thing. And then as you start to write, like you say, you kind of wonder, well, what would they wear? Okay, that's fairly easy. You can maybe kind of find that in books and this sort of thing. And then you might have a character pull a weapon or eat some food or smoke a cigarette or something. And you think, well, actually, hang on, would they have had cigarettes? If they did, even if they were around at the time, even if they were mass produced, would they have made their way to central Queensland, where, you know, you've got kind of tumbleweed blowing through dust blown towns and all this kind of thing? The weaponry, you know, all this kind of thing was fascinating, to be honest. I mean, I think maybe because I used to be an attorney, so I kind of don't mind a bit of research, and you can disappear down some absolute rabbit holes. You can waste days kind of going into this stuff. But then what you need to do almost is pare it back. And as an author, what you want the reader to feel is that the world you've created is natural, and you're not kind of wearing your research on the page. I can't remember who said it. I'm going to totally plagiarize someone now, but there was some famous author said that if you imagine your kind of stack of research papers, what you want to do is you just want to kind of peek inside the envelope, just kind of lift the corner, and that's all the reader needs, because you just need to know that I've done the work and the details you're getting are correct, and it makes it real. That's the job. That's where kind of the research comes in. But yeah, sure, it was fascinating, and I mean, some of the things I found myself researching. I think the strangest one was maybe what was the price of a saddle in 1890 in like remote kind of Western Queensland, and I don't even know if I got a dead-on answer for it, but I found the price of one somewhere else and maybe figured, well, bump it up a little or knock it down a bit, and I'm sure it'll be fine.
No, that's so interesting to hear, and I love that corner antidote you gave us, of that, like, the research of this. We've only got the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of what the research that you've done behind all of that. But I want to talk a little bit about the thriller aspect of this book, because not only do you put us in a world that, like I said, I knew nothing about, some of our, especially Colorado readers, might know nothing about, but they're huge fans of the West and this adventure series, that time period. But the thriller, even in just that sliver of a reading you gave us, what is so fascinating about the genre of thriller to you, and what made you want to write in it?
Well, what I loved about writing this book is I kind of got to have my cake and eat it. So I could write a thriller, but I could also write kind of a love story, a courtroom drama, a historical novel. I can explore themes, as wide as, well, all the things we've talked about. And I can build all of that on this kind of scaffold of hopefully a kind of just ripping page turner, where my intention with it was to kind of try and get the momentum to just like roll and roll and roll, so that by the end, hopefully the reader's kind of just breathlessly turning the pages to see what happens next. And yeah, I mean, I grew up reading thrillers. Like, it was the first thing that kind of got me into reading as a sort of young teenager. Plowing through the likes of, well, I was going to say Stephen King, obviously thriller horror. James Patterson's, your John Grisham's, kind of all that sort of thing. So I'm a sucker for a page turner, for a cliffhanger, and I got to indulge all of that in this book. And what I particularly enjoyed, I think, was being able to jump between different characters. So we kind of alternate between Tommy and Billy. We get Catherine Sullivan, who is the young widow.
We're going to talk about Catherine.
Great. But what you get to do, and the first time I kind of knew that this worked was when my wife was reading the book. She didn't get to read it until it was finished, and she was reading it in bed, and she'd be like, one more chapter, just one more chapter, because you kind of get to the end of, say, a Tommy chapter, and then you realize, oh yeah, where did we leave Billy? And then you need to kind of pick up Billy's story, and so on and so forth. So the technique of the thriller served me perfectly, and I enjoyed it, but it gave me that kind of license to explore all the other stuff too, without ever losing sight of the story at the heart of the book.
No, that's great that it opened up all those doors to be able to have subplots abound for this book. And so I said that we were going to talk about Catherine, and I want to talk about her and Bobby and Tommy and these perspectives that you have in the book, and voice. You get to play with this plot, as we talked about, threading in all these different avenues to make it this really page-turning story. However, you have to keep the voice of the characters straight. You have to keep their paths and their motivation straight. Can you elaborate more about that process, and what was it like writing from all these different perspectives?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, not to get too technical, but kind of voice and point of view are for the writer are kind of two slightly different things. So, and this is what's kind of cool about doing this sort of book, because you get to sort of maintain your voice throughout the book. It's always my kind of storytelling voice, but you get to to just tilt the lens slightly, depending on who is the point of view character for each chapter, and it serves the book really well, and it's great fun for me as a writer, and hopefully for the readers too, because you get to inhabit. For example, let's take those three. So you've got Billy and Tommy, the two brothers, who have very contrasting outlooks, very contrasting personalities, and recollections of the events that have shaped them, and then responses to that as well.
Their memories are so different of the same event. That was so interesting to me, of like, oh my gosh, just from where you're standing and what you're participating in. I loved that part. I'm sorry, please continue.
No.
I give you props on that point.
Absolutely. And then what was brilliant about Catherine in this book was being able to kind of put this strong female character in the midst of all these men who are kind of squabbling over land and shooting each other and all that kind of thing, and see her grow. I mean, she starts off, I'm not giving anything away here, but she starts off as a kind of child bride. Basically, she's sold off by her father, on her 18th birthday, to a wealthy landowner, with the idea that she's supposed to produce sons. And she's shipped out from the city to the middle of the outback. She knows nothing of that world, and she's thrown to the wolves, basically. And then she's widowed young, and is presented with this opportunity. She's got this huge cattle ranch. I mean, it's like one of the biggest in Queensland. It sort of falls in her lap. And the question is, can she hang on to it? And can she hang on to it without a husband? And we see her kind of go from, when we meet her in chapter 1 in this book, potentially being sold off again by this father, to then, she grows up, she matures, and by the end of the novel, she's kind of become the person that maybe she never thought she could be, but that she would have to be in order to thrive in this world. And she was great fun to write. I absolutely love Catherine. She gets some of the best lines. She's very quick-witted. She's got some great put-downs. She puts some men properly in their place.
Right in their place. It's so
and she's a fighter as well. We kind of sometimes in these books and in these settings, you kind of equate strength or whatever with the physical, with the violence that's going on. But she doesn't have that advantage, and she needs to stick up for herself in other ways, and she finds a way to do that. And I think, or I kind of hope, it emerges as a real hero in this story. So
I thought so. That's why I wanted to talk about her. But I feel like if we go into any more depth, we're going to give spoilers. So I do want to switch over to the other, what I would argue, one of the most fascinating characters in this entire book is Noon. And how, okay, he's a creepy dude. I don't know any other way to put it. What a horrible person. What was writing that like?
Well, I mean, this guy, he is... Yeah, he's a very complicated person. I mean, he's a bad man, but he's also very intelligent. He's very perceptive. He's manipulative. He's ruthless, brutal, amoral. He's almost certainly a psychopath, and he's been put he's been put in a position of kind of huge authority in the government of the time. And given a kind of carte blanche to not only enforce, I'm going to use this term loosely, but enforce laws as they were, but also indulge his own kind of worst habits. So he was fascinating to write, because you can't create a villain in 2D. It just won't work. Readers won't have it. He won't come alive on the page. If you want to truly kind of scare people, or you want them to feel, at least feel the other characters' fear, then Noon as a villain had to be believable. The starting point for him, though, is that men like him existed, and they are there in the history books. And he's not modeled on anyone in particular. He's purely my own kind of invention. But there was one quote that I once read in a newspaper in 1875 it was, and it was a description of a native police officer. So just to recap for anyone who kind of missed the start, the native police were this legal but essentially kind of outlaw band of there was a white European officer with a small group of Aboriginal troopers who would patrol up and down the Queensland frontier, as they called it, dispersing Aboriginal Australians as and when they saw fit. In reality, they slaughtered them. To get back to what I was going to say, there was this article about one of these officers, and what it basically said was, I'm going to try and remember it verbatim here. It said, he inspired the local Aboriginals with such a wholesome dread that you only had to say his name and they would go running pell-mell into the bush. And that's an
like
of the time quote.
Voldemort. Like that's where we're at right now. Like,
yeah.
Cow. Wow.
So my job is then, okay, so if that's what these guys were actually like, and you can imagine they probably were, I need to breathe life into that. I need to create someone who the very mention of his name is scary enough that people kind of, run. So that's what I set out to do with Noon, but to do so in a way that, like I say, he all the best villains are real, right? You think of kind of Hannibal Lecter or Tom Ripley or Anton Chigurh or anyone, and they have at their core a kind of twisted humanity. Now, you might not like them, and you might not want to spend any time with them or as little time as you possibly can, but you recognize that men like that, or women, could have existed. And that's what I kind of needed to do. So writing him was both kind of a challenge. It was fun in a perverse sort of way. But there was, to my mind, there was nothing ever kind of had to be gratuitous about him. He just had to, and in fact, and this might be a bit of a cliche, but you hear authors saying this sort of thing all the time, where the characters take over the story, right?
And you hear it, but it's true.
It's true. And Noon did that. I mean, there were plenty of things that he did in this book that I wouldn't have wanted him to do. But when he got to that situation and he just kind of did it, and I thought, well, I can't change that because it just fits. It just totally fits. So yeah, I do hope that he works as a villain, and I hope people hate him, and I also hope people kind of love him in a weird, twisted kind of way.
That's why I said he was fascinating, because it's really, that's where it comes from, is this, I hate him, and yet I found myself itching for not more of him, but I wanted him to like stay away. But it was very interesting when he would come up. And I think that, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, and you can see the effect that he has on the brothers too. So Tommy and Billy, they, just as they deal with their past in different ways, they also relate to Noon in different ways. And for Tommy, and again, this is no spoiler, this happens in chapter 2, he's this kind of spectre that haunts his dreams, both waking and sleeping. Whereas for Billy, he kind of wants to try and dismiss the man and say, like, I've grown up now. I'm a man. I'm his equal. I can deal with a guy like that. But as we saw in that little moment that I've read out, it's not that easy. It's not.
He tried to psych himself up. No, it reminds me of, in my playwriting classes in college, being the theater major I am, they would tell us about, you learn the most about a character by what other characters say about them. And I think that we got a lot of that, particularly about Noon, from how the boys and the brothers reacted to him and how his reputation preceded him and what other people said about him, for sure.
Yeah.
I feel like I keep asking you questions all night, but we've got audience questions too. Okay. I want you to add, you want to add your little bit that you
I was going to say, and the other thing is, as well as kind of seeing how others respond to it, is to not kind of have him too available to the reader. So you don't want him there all the time. I mentioned Hannibal Lecter. Think about him. When Anthony Hopkins won the Oscar in Silence of the Lambs. 16 minutes. Yeah.
16 minutes.
Exactly. So you kind of withhold, and they become more sort of ominous. That is Noon, and I can't wait for people to meet him.
Oh, they're gonna hate him so much. Well, so that being said, I want to move on to some of our audience questions that we have here, because I'm enjoying this conversation about craft and story, and this story in particular. But speaking of which, what made you want to write a sequel and continue this story from the first one?
Okay, so yeah, we kind of mentioned the other book. Let me just hold it up briefly in case people don't know. So this is Only Killers and Thieves that came out in 2018. They are kind of one does follow the other, but I very much wanted them both to work as standalone books. So
I did not read Only Killers and Thieves before this one. In fact, it wasn't until I was doing research for this interview that I was like, oh, crud, did I miss something? And it was
you didn't.
no, I didn't. It held up just on its own. And I just want to encourage readers of that too, that if they can't get a copy or that they want to just dive into this one, please do. It's worthwhile. Dust Off the Bones.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so pleased it worked like that for you, because that was very much the intention. And what we kind of have is like two halves of a story. So with Only Killers and Thieves, we have the sort of the event. It's all about the brothers losing their family and then what happens thereafter. What I wanted to move on to write about was kind of the consequences of that. And it's not just the consequences for the characters, but the consequences for society at the time. You know, there are an awful lot of parallels between Australia in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and right now, both here in the UK, in Australia, and in America. And it's the question of accountability that really kind of leapt out at me as to what I wanted this book to be about. I wanted to see what became of the brothers. I wanted to see how they grew up. I wanted to see what happened to Catherine Sullivan. Could she kind of hang on to her ranch? Could she survive? I wanted to see what happened to Noon. Would he ever be held accountable for the things that he did? Would the brothers hold themselves accountable for their role? And how does a society that is kind of born from, you know, difficult times, frontier times, violence, kind of endemic racism, how does it move on and then look back at itself and either, as we talked about with the brothers, bury its head in the sand, acknowledge what it did, try and make amends, try and hold those in power accountable for the things that were done, because we see it now. You know, at the time I was writing this, I was watching parliamentary inquiries, Senate hearings, you know, congressional hearings, criminal trials, where people were literally getting away with murder because they were in positions of power. And you look at it and you think, my God, you know, nothing's changed. We're kind of going back 100 years and it's exactly the same. So that was kind of the reason for wanting to, aside from all this stuff, you know, the kind of the thriller things and wanting to see what happened to the characters and all that stuff. It was this question of, well, what comes next? When something really bad has happened, what comes next, both individually, on a societal level, kind of institutionally? And I thought there was an awful lot of crossover between, you know, what almost shouldn't be. You know, you think about kind of America in 2021 and outback Australia in 1897. There shouldn't be any crossover, but I think there is. So that's kind of where Dust Off the Bones came from.
I'm so glad you brought that up too, because that was something, again, I don't want to say that I don't need Only Killers and Thieves, but there was something about the fact that I guess I didn't need the event. Like I understood what had happened, and I was like, okay, what are we going to do? What's happening here?
Yeah.
Is it going to get punished? You know? And so, like I said, I do want to still go back and read the first one, but in the way that you talked about consequences, it makes me keep thinking about it more of like, oh yeah, because that was a huge point in the book of that. Like, I didn't need to see the crime to know that stuff came from it.
I'm pleased you did that, not me. You know, this was very much written as a book that hopefully gives enough background that it stands on its own, but wouldn't spoil Only Killers and Thieves. So the way I kind of think of it is, if you read Dust Off the Bones and you feel like reading the other one, think of it like a prequel, almost like, you know, you can go back and see where these characters came from and, you know, where the origins of this story are. If you happen to have read Only Killers and Thieves, then great, you can dive straight in and you get the sequel. But to my mind, you can read them either way around, one or the other. Hopefully at least one. Then
and both. We read both.
Yeah.
And you get both at tatteredcover.com. I'll plug that real quick in here. But speaking of the storyline and your books, sometimes I hate asking this question of authors because you just came out with a book, but it is here. Is there another book in this storyline, or what are you working on now?
Well, yeah, in this storyline, I'm not so sure. I mean, I kind of never say never. That I would need to find a way to go back to it, and I need to find a reason to go back to it. A bit like I was talking about with the whole kind of accountability thing. Yeah, I kind of work in a weird way. I sort of throw ideas at the page and just kind of see if anything sticks. So at the minute, I'm kind of in the early stages of writing 2 books. They're totally different to this, but I don't know if either of them will ever make it. It's just the way I've tried to be more organized. You always read about kind of authors who they'll have an idea and they'll kind of plan it all out. They'll have tables and charts and post-it notes and all this kind of thing, and they know exactly where they're going. And I'm like, man, I'd love to do that, but it just doesn't kind of work for me.
They call that pantsers versus plotters.
Yeah,
plotters
there you go.
And then you write by the seat of your pants.
Yeah.
That's okay. I think it's fascinating. That's the thing, is that we actually get a lot of craft questions, and we focus on that somewhat because we have a lot of writers in our audience that are aspiring publishing authors, and they love asking those questions. And it's always really nice to hear about a creative process that is different. Yours doesn't match John Grisham's. I've talked to John Grisham. I can say that flat out, but that doesn't mean that there's one better than the other. You still produce wonderful, readable books, so it's really cool to hear.
And you just kind of need to find what works for you, I guess.
Yes.
And not try and change it. It's like, it's kind of, once you've found a way that creates something, just stick with it.
Yeah, absolutely. This one's an interesting one too, and I will agree with this comment here about this book felt so cinematic to me. Have you ever thought about exploring movies, movie rights, or writing for movies?
Yes, please. Yes, please. No, I mean, I can't say too much about it, I don't think. But there's interest in bringing these stories to the screen, whether that be small or big screen. And I am working with some people on kind of potentially doing that, but like with all these things, it's always subject to goodness knows how many different kind of loops you've got to jump through and everything else. So I can't kind of count any chickens on that front at all. But I definitely think that it could be adapted. When the way I write is I kind of see the movie playing out in my head, and I just kind of write what I see almost. So it's almost like I've already seen the adaptation. But I would love for this to make it onto a screen, because I think there's real potential there, particularly with that kind of landscape we were talking about.
Right? Oh, the setting alone would be gorgeous. Cinematographer's dream.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I got 2 more questions here before we end tonight. One of which is, how do you go from being a lawyer to being a writer?
You get bored as being a lawyer, basically.
I think it's more of the question of like, how did you find that passion in your life, and why did you pursue it?
Absolutely. I mean, so I kind of always wanted to do something creative, but it was never the sensible career choice, right? No one sets out to be an author if you want to be able to pay rent, or buy food, or all those kind of essential things. So I did the sensible career path, and then around about the age of 30, I sort of reached a bit of a career crossroads where it's like you either commit to the law firm thing and you really sort of go for it, or you step aside and try and do something else. And that's what I decided to do. So I wrote a number of other novels before Only Killers and Thieves, and each one was a kind of learning process. I was pretty green as a writer. I'd not written fiction since high school, basically. And I had an awful lot of reading that I needed to catch up on too, because I hadn't kind of sort of filled the well, as it were, with as much as I should have done during my 20s. So it was from a fairly standing start that I got going as a writer. Had some terrible books that I wrote and will never see the light of day. Some that were better
In that
did see the
drawer.
light of day. Yeah. I did the final thing that I did was we call it an MA, you guys would call it an MFA, at kind of our equivalent of Iowa, the Iowa's Writers Workshop. We've got the University of East Anglia is kind of the same sort of thing over here. And that was almost like the final sort of like piece in the puzzle, in that it gave me time to properly commit to writing and to kind of say, right, this is what I'm doing now. And it was while I was doing that course, I'd kind of already tried to write something like Only Killers and Thieves. But while I was doing that course, Only Killers and Thieves was kind of born. And then after that, it was a fairly quick road to kind of finishing it and publication and that sort of thing. So it was a very long gestation process, followed by a fairly quick kind of turnaround at the end.
Well, no, and again, that's great to hear about the crossroads. And I know that there's a lot of creative types who struggle with that. Well, I gotta eat, but I want to follow my passion. And I mean, exactly. I'm a bookseller, like I get it. And so the last question, though, I want to ask kind of also ties in nicely. You talk about those other books that you wrote that are staying in the drawer, you know, in the process of getting your MA. But what did this book, Dust Off the Bones, teach you?
Oh, that's a great question. Wow. No one's ever asked me that. That's a really good question.
That's my iconic question I ask at the end of every interview.
Yeah, that's really good. Look, let me give a fairly kind of multi-pronged answer. So on just the first kind of surface of it, it taught me a lot of nuances about the history that I maybe didn't realize before that. One of the things being, and this comes back to this issue of accountability we were talking about, as I was reading more about the native police and the idea of doing a sequel and where could it all go and all this kind of thing, I read that despite being considered one of the biggest killers of Aboriginal people at the time, not one single native police officer was ever criminally convicted over an Aboriginal death. And it was just like, you know, especially, as I say, having read what they'd done, then it's like, well, how did they get away with it? So from that aspect, the nuances of the legacy of British colonialism, the kind of infrastructure that was around at the time, the way that these things were done and then excused and covered up, that was all fairly new to me. In terms of like going back to the craft, it was really good fun to kind of jump around between characters. I'd never done that before, I don't think, not in kind of a full length novel. I don't know if it taught me anything, but I kind of got to try something new, and it was great. So from a kind of both a personal sort of research point of view and from a craft point of view, I absolutely loved writing this book. It's basically the kind of book that I would like, if I could go back sort of 10 years ago and say, what sort of book do you want to write? I'd be like, this one. This is the one.
That's amazing. And especially for a sophomore novel, because people talk about like sophomore slumps or something, but this one, like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I know that our readers will too, especially us in Colorado who are still obsessed with the West and cowboys and that open big sky. It is perfect for that audience. And even you thriller fans out there, pick this one up. It is Dust Off the Bones by Paul Howarth. And I want to just give you a chance, Paul, to remind people who you are, where they can find you online, and anything else you want to say before we close out this evening.
Okay, well, just I guess to say thank you for tuning in. Thank you for supporting your local bookstores. Thank you for keeping us all going over the last kind of 18 months, because if people weren't buying books online, if people weren't getting back into stores when they reopened, then we wouldn't be able to keep doing all this. So thank you guys for tuning in and for doing all of that. If you want to find out any more about me, you can go to paulhowarthauthor.com, which is my website, or you can find me on Twitter, which is @PaulHowarth_, because some other Paul Howarth took @Paul Howarth. And I don't know who he is.
Oh, and I'm McKaylee with Tattered Cover Bookstore. I want to thank Paul for joining us tonight. I want to thank you, viewers, for joining us tonight. Or if you're watching at a later date, we appreciate you tuning in. You can check out all of our past author events on our YouTube channel or on our website at tatteredcover.com. Paul, if you'll stick around while I just finish closing this out here. This has been Paul Howarth and his new book, Dust Off the Bones, which you can get your copy at tatteredcover.com. Thank you all so much for joining us here this evening. Stay safe and happy reading all. Good night.